Across centuries and civilizations, the bodies of women became battlegrounds for control, fear, and ritual. When laws failed or faith demanded silence, punishment took on a language of its own: burnings without names, burials without grave, shame masked as ceremony. These were not accidents of cruelty, but deliberate acts carved into the bones of history. In temples, markets, and courts, women were exposed, erased, and broken, not always for crimes, but for stepping beyond the narrow roles the world allowed them. This video unearths the darkest chapters of that legacy, where justice wore the face of torture and obedience was measured in blood. She was not tied to a stake. She was placed in front of one. The distinction matters. Tying implies force, but force wasn't necessary here. She walked on her own feet, bare, head bowed, veiled in white. Her breath was steady, like a ritual, like prayer. The crowd watched her as they might a goddess, but there was no reverence in their silence. Only judgment, only the hunger for purity, fed by bloodless sacrifice. The screams echoing behind her belonged to someone else. Someone she had once whispered with in the shadowed halls of the temple. Another girl, wrapped in white, branded by suspicion. Her cries were fading now. Soon, Cornelia would follow. She had not cried, not once. Not even when the Pontifex Maximus read her sentence. Not when the sacred flame flickered and dimmed under her watch. Not when the Senate called her polluted. Rome had found her guilty of impurity, though no evidence had been offered, no trial had been granted. In the empire that worshipped fire and oaths, she was a living flaw, and flaws could not be allowed to endure. She had broken no commandment, not even spoken a word in her own defense. But that was the point. Her silence was not enough, so Rome would bury her in it. The punishment had been carved into the city's bones long before she was born. Vestal virgins, priestesses of Vesta, were sworn to 30 years of chastity and obedience. They were the keepers of the eternal flame, the holy fire said to protect the empire itself. If one of them failed, if the fire extinguished, or if rumors swirled of forbidden touch, the punishment was older than pity. They were not whipped, they were not hanged, they were buried, alive, because Rome believed that sacred blood could not be spilled, but it could be silenced. And Cornelia had become the vessel for that silence. Her robes brushed the ground as she passed the crowds, and for the first time no one bowed, no one lowered their eyes in respect. She was no longer divine, she was already being erased. The stake was a formality, an echo of executions meant for traitors and witches. But her death would not come by flame or blade, it would come from the earth. Beneath her, in the Campus Celeratus, the field of the wicked, a stone chamber had been carved, a bed of straw, a jug of water, a single flickering oil lamp, just enough to pretend mercy. Cornelia had seen the pit once, years ago, when another Vestal had been buried for crimes no one dared name. Back then, it had seemed like a story carved in myth, something that belonged to another time. Now she stood at its mouth. And Rome, her city, her god, her judge, looked on, not with cruelty, but with the solemn hunger of a ritual that demanded completion. In the heart of ancient Rome, where gods were as real as soldiers and the Senate held more power than kings, purity was not just a virtue, it was law, a concept made sacred, weaponized, and buried into the very architecture of empire. And at the center of this obsession with purity stood not generals or emperors, but 6 girls. They were chosen in silence, not born into priesthood, but drafted into it. Families of noble rank waited anxiously for their daughter's name to be called, not knowing whether to feel honored or haunted. To be a Vestal virgin was the highest calling a Roman girl could receive, and the heaviest burden she could carry. They were taken young, too young to understand what they were giving up. Between the ages of 6 and 10, they were plucked from their homes, severed from their lineage, and led in white procession to the temple of Vesta. There beneath the domed roof where the sacred flame burned endlessly, they made a vow that would define and end their lives. Chastity, 30 years of it. No husband, no child, no closeness. Their bodies became property of the state, temples in themselves, untouchable, unseen. For the first 10 years they learned rituals, incantations, the laws of fire and silence. They learned how to carry themselves like living marble, stoic, emotionless, perfect. The next decade they served, carrying sacred objects during processions, watching over the eternal flame, making sacrifices to gods that demanded nothing less than flawless performance. The final 10 years, they taught the next generation. Their world was not just sacred, it was surveilled. Every gesture, every glance, every breath was measured. They lived in the house of the Vestals, a gated sanctuary within the Forum, surrounded by statues of former sisters, those who had completed their 30 years without incident. But the house had shadows, and those shadows remembered. A Vestal's power was a paradox. On one hand, they were revered. Allowed privileges no other woman in Rome had. They could testify in court. They could ride in chariots. Even a condemned man could be pardoned if he crossed paths with a Vestal on his way to execution. On the other hand, they were prisoners of virtue. Even suspicion, just a whisper, could erase everything. The sacred flame was their symbol and their sentence. If it went out, it wasn't seen as an accident. It meant Rome was angry, the gods displeased, and someone had sinned. Rome couldn't spill the blood of a Vestal. To do so was to invite divine retribution. So it crafted another method, one that preserved the illusion of mercy while enacting unbearable cruelty. Burial alive. It had a name, immurement, a word heavy with finality. The condemned Vestal was taken outside the city's sacred limits to the Campus Celeratus, literally the field of the wicked. There, beneath the earth, a small room waited, dug out like a tomb. Inside, a low bed, a single lamp, a jug of water, a loaf of bread, and a bowl of milk. Enough, they claimed, to show Rome did not kill her. It merely placed her beyond its protection. This legal sleight of hand was Rome's way of saying, she did this to herself. The ceremony began like a funeral. She was dressed in burial robes, her head covered in mourning cloth, her eyes lowered as though already dead. The city did not cheer, it did not mourn, it simply watched. The Pontifex Maximus, Rome's highest priest, offered prayers not for her soul but for Rome's safety. Her death was not a tragedy. It was insurance, an offering, her burial a necessary ritual to restore divine balance. Then came the descent. She climbed down a narrow ladder into the pit. Alone, no one followed, no one helped. Once her feet touched the cold stone floor, the ladder was withdrawn, the entrance sealed. Above, priests piled earth until the chamber disappeared beneath the soil. Her breath, her heartbeat, her death, all hidden. No scream would escape. No body would be recovered. Rome would not speak her name again. The story of Cornelia was not unique. She was one of at least 10 Vestals buried in Roman history, though records are intentionally vague. Rome liked its blood invisible. One of the earliest known cases was Oppia, condemned in 483 BCE. No crime was named, only that she had dishonored the vow. Another, Minutia, accused of dressing too luxuriously. Others were said to have merely smiled at the wrong man. But Cornelia's case stands out because she had done nothing. The sacred fire had dimmed during her watch, true, but no man had been found. No testimony offered. The flame had flickered. That was enough. What made her execution more chilling was how polished it was. A ritual so practiced, so rehearsed, it had become beautiful, holy. It wasn't justice, it was theater. And she had been cast in the final act. The paradox at the heart of Rome was this. It claimed to worship its Vestals, yet buried them like criminals. It built statues to those who survived their term and dug grave for those who failed, whether by action or rumor or simple misfortune. Cornelia had once lit that sacred fire with her own hands. Now, the city that taught her how to revere it had declared her impure. No one visited her tomb because no tomb remained. She had been erased, not just from the temple, but from memory. That was the real punishment, not the starvation, not the suffocation, the forgetting. Inside the pit, there was no sound, only breath. Only the hush of cloth against skin as Cornelia sat slowly on the rough straw bed laid for her like a mockery of comfort. The space was not wide enough to pace, not tall enough to stand straight. The walls were damp, already gathering the sweat of the earth. The ceiling hung so low that the air itself felt heavier. There was no ceremony anymore, no priest standing at the opening, no hand to hold. Just silence and time, hours maybe, or days. No one knew how long a woman could last in such a place. That was Rome's final cruelty. It didn't just kill you, it asked you to count the moments until death arrived. A single oil lamp burned beside her. The flame flickered softly, throwing her shadow onto the walls like a ghost clinging to the last place it would ever live. Cornelia watched it, not with fear, but with an awful stillness. That flame, too, would die. She had failed to protect the sacred fire above. And now this, the final fire, was hers alone to watch disappear. She pressed her hand to the cold stone beneath her, fingertips tracing the cracks in the earth that would soon take her. Her breathing slowed. She whispered to herself, not prayers, not curses. Just her own name, again and again, so that someone something would remember. "Cornelia," she said into the dark. "Cornelia." The lamp sputtered. Rome would forget her. It was already forgetting. Above her, the priests had already returned to the temple. The crowd dispersed. Another girl would be chosen to fill her place. The house of the Vestals would go on untouched by her absence. That was how it worked. The sacrifice had to be total. No legacy, no grave, no mention in the records beyond a vague line in a senator's scroll. The food beside her lay untouched. Bread, milk, water, Rome's illusion of mercy. She knew the trick. These were not rations, they were symbols, tokens to absolve the executioners. As if the offering of crust and clay pitcher could cleanse the murder of innocence. The light dimmed. Her eyes, once trained to read omens in fire and shadow, now stared into a place where no god lingered. Even Vesta had left her. That perhaps was the final betrayal. She tried not to cry. Her tears had been taken from her long before the burial. Years of training had burned the softness out of her. But still, a single sob escaped her lips. It echoed back at her like the voice of another woman, a mirror of pain thrown against the walls. Time stretched. The lamp, guttering now, gave its final breath, and darkness took her. No one heard her last words. No one saw how her body fell, whether she curled into herself like a child or reached upward toward the stone ceiling with one final act of defiance. It didn't matter. Rome had already moved on. Chamber she died in would be used again. Dug out, cleansed, prepared for the next girl, the next betrayal, the next silence. She was not buried by accident. She was buried as symbol. Her life consumed not by failure but by ritual. Rome needed someone to blame. The fire faltered. Cornelia was closest, that's all. Her death was not about sin or guilt. It was about preservation of power, of image, of divine control. Her life was sacrificed so that Rome could pretend it was still holy. But somewhere beneath the marble forums, the bronze altars, the carved names of emperors and gods, there was still a place where the soil remembered. A place where breath had once vanished into the dark, and a girl whispered her name until her voice, too, was swallowed. Cornelia, not saint, not sinner. Just forgotten, but not all forgotten women were buried in silence. In Persia, fire spoke louder than earth, and it was flame, not soil, that swallowed the condemned. The stake wasn't built for her. It had stood there long before she was born, rough wood splintered with heat, blackened at the base, silent witness to 100 forgotten screams. But today it waited for her, and when they brought her out, barefoot and bound in coarse linen, no one met her eyes. She didn't scream, not when the guards tied her wrists with ceremonial rope, not when the priest turned away before the torch was lit. She looked at the flame as it approached and tilted her head, as if meeting something she'd long expected, something not feared but accepted. Her lips parted once, not in protest, but to speak a name, maybe her own, maybe her sister's. The wind stole it before it reached anyone's ears. Her family did not come, her city did not mourn. There were no witnesses, only shadows stretching long in the orange dusk. She had not stood trial, no record would be carved, no tablet inscribed. The priest would not mention her in temple prayers, and her ashes would be swept away before morning. Whatever she had done or been accused of would burn with her. And yet she was not alone in her silence. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of women had stood where she now stood. The punishment was old, older than empire, older than scripture. Fire had always been the final answer to the question, what do we do with a woman who does not fit? Some were said to be witches, others lovers, others simply too clever, but all met the same end, without procession, without record, without mercy. The fire that consumed them was not public spectacle. It was cleansing, ritual, a quiet rebalancing of a world that could not tolerate their presence. They were made ash before their names could be spoken, their stories reduced to smoke before they could be written. And when the flames rose that night in the temple courtyard, no one saw them. No one needed to, because in Persia, forgetting was not a mistake. It was the sentence. In ancient Persia, fire was not just a tool, it was divinity itself. To the Zoroastrians, the spiritual stewards of the Achaemenid and Sassanid empires, fire was purity incarnate. It was light in darkness, the breath of Ahura Mazda, the god of truth. Sacred flames burned in temples across the empire, tended by white-robed priests who believed the fire could cleanse not just bodies, but souls. To extinguish a fire was blasphemy. To defile it was worse than murder. But when women were thrown into that fire, no priests cried foul. because not all flames were sacred. There were other fires, hidden fires, set at dusk in temple courtyards, behind palace walls, deep in the mountain outposts where records didn't reach. Fires that didn't purify but erased. Women accused of witchcraft, adultery, or betrayal were not granted trials. Often, they weren't even accused formally. A whisper was enough, a neighbor's glance, a husband's sudden suspicion, and once suspicion touched them, fire followed. Some were burned for practicing black magic, a term as vague as it was deadly. Persia's vast empire swallowed many cultures, many gods, and many fears. Women who brewed herbs or spoke to spirits were easy targets. A rival could denounce them, a priest could condemn them, a husband could dispose of them, and the fire would do the rest. Others were accused of adultery, but adultery did not always mean betrayal of marriage. It could mean being seen too often near a man, laughing too freely, walking without a veil. A slave girl, barely more than a child, could be burned for resisting her master. A noblewoman could be burned for speaking against a decree. These were not crimes against the law. They were crimes against order. The fire made sure no disorder remained. Persia's legal code, when written, seemed precise. There were laws for theft, taxes, land ownership. When it came to women and the invisible boundaries they were not allowed to cross, there was only interpretation. And interpretation was dangerous. The Magi, Persia's priestly class, held immense power. They alone read the Avesta, the sacred texts. They alone declared what was pure and what was profane. And women, by default, were considered closer to defilement. Their blood, their birth, their bodies, it made them both feared and disposable. Yet these burnings were not acts of chaos. They were quiet. Systematic. A woman would disappear from her home in the evening. No trial, no sentence carved in stone. By sunrise, her name would be spoken in past tense if at all. Neighbors might ask where she went. Most didn't. Those who did were told she had been dealt with. Her ashes scattered before morning prayers. Temple records were curiously blank. Scrolls that documented harvests and troop movements said nothing of executions. Oral traditions hint at the rest. In old stories passed between midwives and weavers, there are mentions of women of smoke or sisters lost to fire. These were not legends, they were warnings. Some accounts describe secret fires lit behind mountain temples. Others tell of women thrown into pits, firewood piled on top, the smell of burning flesh carried into the sky. One tale speaks of a priestess who questioned a command and was burned within the same temple she had served. Another tells of 3 sisters accused of binding men's minds. They vanished the same night. The flames seen from the hilltops were blamed on a ritual. None of their names survive. That's how this punishment worked. It wasn't just about death. It was about erasure. Fire left no body to bury, no blood to stain the ground. It left ash, dust, a silence that suited the society it served. And so Persia, the empire of kings and philosophers, of poets and astronomers, built its glory on fire that gave light, and fire that took it away. 2 flames, one in the temple, the other in the shadows behind it. They called her the oracle's sister. Not a name, not a person, a shadow of someone else. Her own name, whatever it was, had already been scrubbed from the temple records. Her face had never been carved into stone or painted on tile. Her life had existed in the thin margins of another woman's glory. Her older sister, the famed Oracle of Re, was beloved by nobles and feared by priests. She gave visions to kings and spoke riddles the empire took as truth. And yet her sister remained unnamed, always beside, never in front, always watching, never watched, until the night her voice rose above a whisper. The story begins with a procession, a royal celebration in the shadow of a sacred fire where the oracle was to offer blessings for the harvest. Her sister walked behind her, carrying ceremonial incense. But when a high-ranking noble insulted a group of temple women, calling them useless, unclean, the oracle remained silent. Her sister did not. She stepped forward. She spoke. She said, "The fire sees you." Just 4 words, not a curse, not even a prophecy. Just truth spoken where silence was expected. By morning she was gone. Whispers spread through the temple like smoke. The oracle would not speak. The priests would not explain. Guards sealed off the cliffside shrine by noon, and by nightfall the flames were lit. They did not use the sacred fire. No, that would have been desecration. Instead, they built another, down below, where the stones sloped away from the city, hidden from the path of pilgrims. The stake stood at the edge of a ravine, battered by years of use. The wind howled through the cracks in the stone like it mourned in her place. She was bound by leather straps. Her hands were tied in front of her, a mercy that mocked her dignity. Her veil was removed, her robes stained from the path. And though no priest read her sentence aloud, every eye watching knew what had been written between the lines. She had spoken against a noble, she had broken the chain of silence, and that in ancient Persia was enough to burn. The oracle did not attend. Whether she refused or was forbidden is unknown, but stories say that when the flames rose, the oracle screamed from her chambers and tore the veil from her altar, a defilement so great that she too was soon vanished, not burned, but replaced. That night only a few attendants stood by, a magus, some guards, and 2 temple women tasked with gathering the ashes before dawn. No one prayed, no one wept. The torch was brought forward by a trembling hand. She did not plead, she did not flinch. Instead, she looked toward the ravine, where the wind met the sky, and whispered something that no one could hear. The flames were not loud. They rarely were in that dry wind. They curled up her robes like curious snakes, then wrapped around her limbs, consuming with methodical indifference. Her eyes did not close until her hair caught fire. Her body jerked once. Then stillness. By morning, only soot and a pile of darkened bone remained. No memorial was built. Her ashes were scattered off the cliff, as if she had never stood there, as if she had never dared speak in a world that demanded she stay quiet. But her story lived, not in scrolls, not in temple archives, but in the mouths of the forgotten. Old women spoke of her in riddles. She walked with the flame and was not burned until she opened her mouth. Others passed her tale between breaths, no louder than the wind. Girls in the temple learned to chant without speaking, to bow without rising, to pray without asking, because the lesson had been carved in ash. Fire doesn't only consume, it erases. Over the centuries, Persia changed, dynasties fell, new gods came, new laws. The fire temples closed or crumbled, replaced by mosques, then ruins, then desert. But the stake remained. Hidden near the edge of the old shrine, its base charred black and half buried in stone. No one remembered the names of the women it claimed. But the stone remembered. The soil still tasted the ash. And now only fragments remain, oral histories, folklore, the hushed stories of a sister who once dared to speak. They say if you stand on that cliff at dusk, when the sky glows like embers and the wind rushes through your hair, you can still hear her. Not her scream, her breath, a whisper, a reminder that forgetting is not healing, that some purifications are crimes, and that when fire becomes a judge, it leaves behind no truth, only silence. But if Persia chose silence through fire, the Greeks chose humiliation through exposure, forcing women not into ash, but into shame, laid bare before gods and men alike. She was not sentenced to death, but what they gave her instead left no breath, no dignity, no voice, only skin exposed, trembling, and offered like a sacrifice. She walked barefoot through the marble colonnade of the temple, each step echoing louder than the last. Her wrists were bound with red-dyed wool, a symbol of ritual, but to her it felt like leashing. Her head, once crowned with braids, had been shorn. The priestess cut it herself, each lock falling to the ground like the shedding of identity. Her hair would be buried with the dead. She was alive, but they wanted her to feel otherwise. She was not a criminal, at least not in the way we understand it. She hadn't stolen or murdered or led an army against the state. Her crime was far more dangerous to the Greek mind. She had spoken too loudly to the wrong men about the wrong things. The sentence came from the temple council, though no formal court heard her case. She would not be confined or exiled. She would be seen, displayed. She would walk the length of the sacred ground naked under Apollo's sun before the very gods she was said to have dishonored. She didn't weep. That would have pleased them. Instead, she held her mouth closed like a tomb, but her eyes, those wide, burning eyes, betrayed her. The temple steps were lined with citizens, men mostly, scholars, traders, judges. They didn't shout, they didn't touch, they just watched, and that was worse. Because in ancient Greece, especially Athens, the body wasn't hidden, it wasn't shameful by default. But when forced into exposure, when stripped and paraded in ritual, the naked body became a statement, a verdict. The wool around her wrists symbolized binding to the divine, the shorn hair a denial of femininity, the silence enforced. Her body was not hers, it belonged to the judgment of the gods and the pleasure of the polis. She was not flogged, she was not burned, but they took her skin and made it a scroll on which her guilt was written. In a land of laws and oracles, her punishment wasn't physical violence, it was spiritual dismemberment, and every eye watching played a part. In the golden age of Athens, where philosophy flowered and democracy was forged, freedom was a word reserved for men. Women were not citizens. They could not vote, hold office, or speak in assembly. Their lives were enclosed, first by fathers, then by husbands. Their voices were meant for the hearth, their opinions for whispered halls. But when a woman breached that silence, the city had its own way of restoring balance. It didn't draw blood, it didn't dig grave, it stripped her bare. The ritual had many names: atimia or dishonor, timoria or punishment. Sometimes it hid behind religious rites. Other times it masqueraded as purification, but always it aimed for the same thing: exposure. Public, deliberate, and devastating. In Athens, a woman accused of moral corruption, unseemly speech, or public defiance might be sentenced to anatrepsis, a ritual procession in which she would be paraded, nude or partially clothed, through sacred spaces. She would walk past the altars of the gods, past statues of Athene and Artemis, past the eyes of citizens and magistrates. Her name would be read aloud, her supposed crime declared, not with fury, with ceremony. This was not about punishment, it was about performance, a stage on which the city cleansed itself of discomfort by making her the vessel of its fear. She would not be whipped, but her hair would be cut, a symbolic stripping of beauty and identity. She would not be gagged, but she would not be allowed to speak. A priest might walk beside her, reciting lines from sacred law. She would be forbidden to look up. Her gaze must fall to the stones, as if unworthy to meet the eyes of gods or men. In Sparta, the ritual was more brutal. There, women could be dragged to the center of the agora, the public square, and forced to perform manual labor in silence, naked under the sun. They would be mocked as whores or witches, depending on the day. Some were forced to stand before the temple of Artemis Orthia, while girls whipped them with rods in rites disguised as festival games. The logic was always the same. If a woman strayed from the role assigned to her, if she spoke, seduced, resisted, she would be made into an example. Not erased, but exposed, because exposure lingered. It lived in the memory of the polis. Children would whisper her story. Husbands would use her name as a warning. Even when forgiven, she would never be restored. Her identity, once stripped, could not be reclothed. And at the heart of this ritual was the temple itself. The Greeks saw the divine not just in the heavens, but in symmetry, in balance. Temples were not only houses of worship, they were courts. Their steps saw more trials than the archon's bench. And when the accused was a woman, the gods themselves were said to judge. Statues of Athene loomed over such punishments, not blindfolded, like modern personifications of justice, but fully aware, eyes open, spear in hand. The message was clear: virtue is something you wear, and if you lose it, you will be stripped, physically, socially, and spiritually. Philosophers like Plato and Xenophon spoke of sophrosyne, self-restraint, as the highest female virtue, but it was not a virtue one could demonstrate, only lose. And when lost, the punishment wasn't death. It was display. To be laid bare before the gods and men was to become a warning, a breathing statue of disgrace. And when the ceremony ended, there was no return. The wool was unbound, the hair would grow back, but the eyes, those hundreds of watching eyes, would never forget. She could live, but she would never again be unseen. She had been a widow for only 3 months when they came for her, not in the night, not with chains, but in daylight, with a folded parchment and an official seal. 3 men, draped in white and bronze, standing on her doorstep with downcast eyes and stiff shoulders, as if ashamed of the summons they delivered. Her name was Thalia. She lived on the outskirts of Delphi, in a modest stone home built on land her husband had purchased before falling in war. A woman alone, with no sons, no father, and no dowry left to trade, was already suspect in the eyes of the polis. But Thalia was more than alone. She taught, not weaving or herbs or hymns, but speech, ideas. She had begun to host young girls and occasionally curious boys in her courtyard, reciting fragments of poetry, logic, and tales once reserved for men. She quoted Sappho, Euripides, even dared to question Hesiod. Her voice was soft, but her thoughts cut deep. And so rumors began that she was turning girls against their fathers, that boys left her home speaking with too much grace and too little fear, that she was corrupting youth. The charge itself was familiar. After all, Socrates had faced the same, but Thalia was no philosopher. She was a woman, and women did not receive trials, only ritual. On the day of her punishment, the priests of Apollo assembled outside the sanctuary. The crowd was smaller than in Athens, but it held the same hunger. Silence pressed down like a hand on the throat. She was brought forward in a simple tunic, her wrists already wrapped in white wool. Her head was bare. Her hair, once long and tied in ribbons of mourning, had been crudely hacked short, not by a blade, but by temple girls who looked away as they worked. A herald stepped forward and read the decree. Thalia, widow of Pyrrhos, is accused of impiety, of spreading discord among the daughters of the city, and of placing personal thought above divine law. Then came the sentence. Let her be displayed before the God who sees all. Let her be silenced by her own shame. The priests gestured, and temple guards untied her tunic. She stood before the temple of Apollo, naked but for the wool at her wrists, the sunlight etching her form into the stone like a statue no artisan would ever claim. Her eyes were fixed on the ground. She had been ordered not to look up, not at the gods, not at the judges, not at the people who had once traded with her, shared wine with her, called her sister. Around her the air grew still. The heat of noon burned into her skin, but she did not tremble. Behind her the high priest read verses from the Delphic maxims, speaking of obedience, humility, silence. His voice echoed across the stones, but the eyes of the crowd were louder. Some pitied her, some judged, others merely watched, empty as statues themselves. And she said nothing. She didn't plead, didn't cry, didn't ask for mercy. She became a mirror for their discomfort. Her body a canvas for the fears they refused to name, that a woman could think, that a woman could teach, that a woman could exist without permission. The ritual lasted an hour. Her name was repeated 3 times by 3 different priests, each time followed by a verse denouncing arrogance and false wisdom. A young girl from the temple sprinkled her with cold water, a symbolic cleansing that did nothing to cleanse the act itself. When it was done, her tunic was returned to her, but her name would never be the same. She was not exiled, that would have been kinder. Instead, she was unwritten, her name struck from temple records, her late husband's estate seized and divided. The young girls who once visited her home were forbidden to speak her name. She was not imprisoned, she was not harmed. She was simply erased. She lived out her years in a rented room near the edge of the city, her presence a quiet discomfort. Children stared, mothers turned away, men passed her as though she was part of the stone. She no longer taught, she no longer spoke. But sometimes in the late evening, when the wind died and the shadows grew long, she would walk the edge of the temple courtyard and trace her fingers across the marble walls, walls that had once reflected her shame like a mirror. She would touch the cracks and wonder how long they had taken to form, how many other women had stood where she had, and how many more would follow. Because in ancient Greece, the worst punishments left no wound, they left silence, exposure. And the permanent weight of 1,000 eyes watching, judging, forgetting. There are no statues of Thalia, no scrolls with her teachings. Her name appears nowhere in official record, but the temple still stands. And in the quiet spaces where history falters, there is still the ghost of a woman standing naked in the sun, surrounded by silence, judged by gods who never spoke back. But while Greek temples turned shame into ritual, Rome did not hesitate. Their women's bodies weren't just exposed, they were broken, chained, and whipped beneath marble arches where law and violence kissed in full view of the crowd. Chained to a marble column, her arms stretched above her head, she did not cry, not when the merchant shouted, not when the lash first kissed her back, not even when her knees gave way and she was forced to hang by her wrists, her toes scraping the dust of the forum floor. Pain had long since become an expected part of her existence. Shame, a requirement, she had already been touched, examined, bargained over, her teeth checked like a horse's, her hips measured like pottery. The buyers poked her belly, pressed her thighs, weighed her breasts in their hands like they might weigh fruit in the market stalls. And yet they had all walked away. Too soft, one had muttered. Too dark, said another. Too clever, whispered a third with a narrowed gaze. And when the last man turned his back in disgust, the dealer snarled under his breath and raised the whip again. Unsellable, he spat, as though it were a verdict. The lash cracked through the air, slicing flesh already tender from days of labor. A fine line of red bloomed down her spine, and still, she did not scream, because screaming meant she still believed someone would listen. The Roman slave markets were not back alleys or secret dens. They stood at the center of cities, in the open, beneath the shadows of arches and gods, The whipping pillar wasn't hidden, it was decorated, polished, etched with names long forgotten and soaked in the skin of thousands who had once thought silence would save them. She had no name now. Just a tag around her neck, marking her origin, age, and the last price offered. She didn't know where she was born anymore. She only remembered the sea voyage, salt crusting her wounds, the stink of vomit and blood in the hull, the songs of the men above deck who wagered over which of the girls would sell fastest. But here in this moment, none of that mattered. She had been priced, paraded, poked, and still left unsold. And that meant punishment, not because she had done wrong, but because she had failed to be profitable. In Rome, slavery was not shameful, it was business. A cold, gleaming machine fed by conquest and greed, built on the broken bodies of those unfortunate enough to be born elsewhere or to lose the wrong war. It wasn't hidden, it wasn't whispered. It was celebrated, etched into mosaics, carved onto coins, praised in the speeches of emperors and senators alike. At the center of this commerce were the Venalisium, the slave markets, vast, organized, and public, not tucked away in alleys or shaded warehouses, but spread across the city like veins. The Forum Boreum, once a cattle market, now sold humans. Women stood in lines, stripped bare beneath the sun, grouped by origin, age, and beauty. Foreignness made them exotic. Youth made them valuable. Disobedience made them dangerous, but also cheap. And when a slave, especially a woman, refused to smile, refused to please, or simply failed to sell, she was brought to the pillar, the whipping pillar. It stood in full view of buyers, priests, and citizens. A tall, polished column of pale marble, always stained near its base, always warm to the touch from the blood that had dried in the heat. Ropes dangled from iron rings at its crown. Chains clattered at its feet. The slave was tied high, arms stretched above her head, back exposed to the sky, spine bowed like a bowstring drawn too tight. The dealer, whether Greek, Roman, or Punic, would raise the whip not in anger but in method. Each lash said something. This is what happens to disobedience. This is how value is restored. This is the cost of not being sold. Whipping was not a last resort. It was advertising, a message to buyers. She is broken now, tamed, cheaper, easier. The woman's pain became her new price tag, and the crowd watched, not with horror, with interest. Some men brought their sons to learn the art of bargaining. Others came to inspect fresh arrivals. But all of them at some point turned to the whipping pillar. They watched as flesh tore, as blood ran down thighs, as the slave's legs buckled and her body trembled under the whip. And when she could no longer cry out, when her voice cracked and her head hung low, then the bidding would begin again. Rome didn't just sell flesh, it sold ownership. The pillar wasn't just a tool, it was a stage. A monument to Rome's belief that control was not a conversation, it was a demonstration. Enslaved women were made examples more often than men, not because they rebelled more, but because they were easier to punish publicly. Their bodies were more visible, more symbolic. A woman whipped beneath the gaze of Jupiter's statue was not just being corrected, she was being redefined, turned from person to property, from voice to silence, from defiant to display. The economics of pain ran deep. A healthy slave might fetch 1,000 sesterces, a skilled one double, but a marked one, a woman with stripes across her back, bruises blooming along her ribs, could be bargained down. And so the whip served both to control and to cheapen. A contradiction only Rome could perfect. Use violence to make a body more manageable, then punish it again for being damaged. And always, the pillar remained, cleaned at dusk, ready at dawn. Inscriptions at its base recorded nothing of the women who bled there, only the names of merchants who paid for its upkeep. The marble itself seemed to glow in the morning light, casting long shadows across the forum stones, as if the city wanted to remember the pillar more than the people it had broken. Slaves came and went, but the pillar endured, a silent witness to the daily ballet of cruelty that Rome dressed in the robes of commerce. Her name had once meant something. It was spoken gently in the hills near Carthage, wrapped in the laughter of sisters and the songs of mothers at harvest. It was whispered in prayer during the Punic festivals and carved onto the edge of a ceramic water jar that rested by her family's doorway. But Rome had no use for Carthaginian names. They were stripped like clothing, burned like flags, forgotten like ruins. She was taken during the Third Punic War, when Rome descended upon Carthage like a beast unchained. Fires tore through the city, temples collapsed, soldiers flooded homes, dragging bodies into the streets, separating children from mothers with mechanical ease. She had been 15, too old to be hidden, too young to be invisible. A Roman tribune had pulled her by the wrist from the rubble, not with anger, but with the precise indifference of someone sorting livestock. She was marched alongside hundreds of others across the North African coast, her wrists bound to the woman beside her, the sea on one side and flame behind them. The survivors walked in silence, some barefoot, some bleeding, all priced. By the time she reached Rome, she had already lost her voice. She answered no questions, cried at nothing. Her eyes stared ahead with the glassy distance of someone who knew that no road led back. She was brought to the market in the Forum Romanum. The dealer grinned when he saw her, exotic, foreign, Carthaginian. He placed her at the front. Let buyers taste her skin, inspect her teeth, run fingers through the ash-caked strands of her hair. She did not flinch, not even when one man remarked she looked wild. She was sold to a senator. He was old, with silver rings and a voice like honey left too long in the jar. He paraded her through his villa like a prize from a foreign hunt, gave her no name, only tasks. She tended gardens, washed feet, served wine. For weeks she obeyed, until the day she knocked over a basin, not intentionally. Her arm had been bruised from an earlier blow and failed her grip. The ceramic shattered. The water soaked the senator's robe. He paused, looked at her for a long time, then smiled, and summoned his guards. She was dragged not to the villa's courtyard, but back to the very market where she had first been sold. The same stall, the same dealer, the same pillar still gleaming like a silent god. The senator wanted her whipped publicly, not just for punishment, for principle. Rome's message was clear: you were bought here, you can be broken here. The crowd gathered fast. Rome loved a spectacle. She was bound to the column, her hands above her head, the rope biting into skin already marred by labor. The whip was ceremonial, black leather, knotted at the end, blessed by a priest to purify disobedience. The dealer struck her first, then the senator's steward. Each lash fell with rhythm, not rage. She did not scream. She had screamed long ago in the ashes of Carthage, and the sound had never returned. The crowd didn't look away. Some flinched, most didn't. When the blood began to paint the pillar, the merchant raised his voice. Let all Rome see the cost of rebellion. Let the mark of the lash remind her of her place. They cheered. The lash fell again. Her back became a map of conquest, of pain, of empire. The welts ran like rivers from shoulder to waist, crossing one another like the borders of Roman provinces. Her skin no longer belonged to her. It was parchment carved by empire. When it ended, she was untied and dropped to the stones. The dealer lifted her face and asked if she understood. She did not answer. Her silence was not surrender, it was survival. She was returned to the senator's house, this time not as servant, but as example. Other slaves were made to watch her limp through corridors. No one spoke to her, not because they feared her, but because she had become a mirror. A living reminder that Rome was not held together by law, but by blood and fear. She healed. But the marks remained. They did not fade. Years later, when the senator died and she was passed to his nephew, the boy asked why her back looked like that. No one answered, because by then she was quiet, efficient, faceless. She had a new name given by her second master. But on certain days, when the sky turned the color of burning olive wood and the wind carried the smell of dust and sweat, she would press her fingers against the scars and remember the sound of the whip, the gleam of marble, the cheer of the crowd, and she would remember that Rome did not need chains to enslave a woman, only a pillar, and the eyes of a city that watched without blinking. But not all women were whipped in daylight. Some were taken behind closed doors, into coffins shaped like saints, where screams bounced off iron, and no one outside ever heard them. She didn't walk toward it. She was pulled, arms shaking, knees raw from the stone, prayers bleeding from her lips with no God left to hear them. But even if she could have run, even if her voice had torn through the thick air of the square, the outcome would have been the same. The Iron Maiden waited. It stood like a saint, carved in feminine shape, its metal face cold and expressionless, arms slightly extended, a mockery of welcome, a steel cloak wrapped around hollow darkness. To the townsfolk gathered that morning, it looked almost holy, like a sculpture built for reverence. And in a way, it was. The woman, no older than 30, had been accused of speaking against the church. Her husband was dead. Her sons gone to war. She had treated fevers with herbs. Spoken plainly in the presence of a priest. Whispered that maybe sickness came from men and not sin. That was enough. The executioners didn't shout. They didn't drag her by the hair. They simply guided her forward. She trembled, barefoot in the cold. The Iron Maiden's doors creaked open with aching slowness, revealing rusted spikes inside. Not daggers, not long enough to kill quickly, but thin metal needles, positioned with terrible precision. One at the chest, one behind each eye. Several along the arms, the back, the legs, enough to puncture, enough to torment, not enough to silence immediately. The crowd watched. With curiosity, not horror, some crossed themselves. Others leaned forward, as if admiring a piece of craftsmanship. The device was rare. Most had only heard stories. Today they would see it breathe. She was placed inside. The door began to close. Her scream came once, sharp and immediate, as the first spikes found skin. Then the hinges sealed her into steel. The sound of the latch locking echoed through the cathedral square. Her voice didn't follow, and that was the point. In the heart of the medieval town, surrounded by priests, merchants, and mothers, the Iron Maiden didn't punish her. It ended her, not just her life, but her defiance, her voice, her truth. The Virgin's embrace had been designed to look like mercy, but inside, it knew only silence. They say the Iron Maiden never existed, that it was a myth, an invention of later centuries, a theatrical lie told by Victorian collectors, crafted for museums and horror books, not for punishment. The real Middle Ages, historians argue, used simpler tools, ropes, fire, blades, not elaborate iron sarcophagi with spikes like teeth and doors that closed like a coffin. But if the Iron Maiden never existed, then why do so many remember it? Why did so many women speak of it in hushed voices, as if it had already claimed someone they knew? Because even if the steel wasn't real, the fear was. The idea of the Iron Maiden, of a machine shaped like a woman, used to destroy a woman, emerged from something deeper than metallurgy. It was forged in the crucible of paranoia, religion, and patriarchy, and whether it stood in every square or only in legend, its message was clear: silence. In the 13th through 15th centuries, women across Europe were persecuted in waves that pulsed with theological hysteria. Wives, widows, midwives, herbalists, and scholars were accused of heresy, witchcraft, or seduction, crimes defined so loosely they could be attached to any woman at any time. To accuse was easy, to defend impossible. And when the trial came, if it came at all, it was a ritual of performance. A priest would list sins from a scroll. Witnesses would mumble half memories. The woman would be asked questions she could not answer without confirming guilt. Do you deny your secret meetings with the devil? Why did the milk in your neighbor's cow dry up after you passed her door? Why did your husband die in his sleep? And once the decision was made, the punishment had to match the spectacle. Enter the devices, the pair of anguish inserted into mouths or other orifices, then twisted until it bloomed. The heretic's fork, metal prongs pressing the chin and chest apart so no words could be spoken. The scavenger's daughter, compressing the body until joints bled. And sometimes, the Iron Maiden. Even if only one ever truly existed, its shadow covered hundreds, because its symbolism was perfect. A punishment shaped like a woman, holy, serene, maternal in appearance, but inside cruel, unrelenting, lined with spikes in places designed to prolong, not end, suffering. The irony of the Virgin's embrace was not lost on those who created it. You sinned, they said, you defied. Now the mother you betrayed will consume you. Women accused of adultery were said to be especially suited for the maiden. So were midwives who helped with abortions, or those whose knowledge of herbs seemed too convenient. The machine was used in paintings, manuscripts, and oral stories. Mothers warned daughters of its arms. Men joked about it in alehouses. Priests whispered its name like a psalm made of iron, and perhaps it was never meant to be real. Perhaps its purpose was to exist always just beyond the edge of truth, because in many towns, the possibility was enough. If a woman thought the Iron Maiden waited for her at the end of a trial, would she not confess earlier? If she feared its jaws more than the fire, would she not beg sooner? The real power of the maiden wasn't in steel. It was in imagination, a punishment that didn't need to exist in numbers because it existed in minds. A horror not worn into the body, but into the culture. A symbol that said, your body is the crime, and the only cure is silence. Her name was Magdalena. She had delivered over 50 children in the town of Nördlingen, deep in the Bavarian lands of the Holy Roman Empire. Her hands had touched more lives than any priest in the chapel. She knew herbs that soothed fevers, balms that stopped bleeding, prayers that helped laboring mothers breathe through the worst of pain. And for years she was left alone, until the bishop's niece died in childbirth. The priest blamed sin, the husband blamed fate, but the crowd blamed the midwife. There had been rumors already that Magdalena knew too much, that her hands were guided by something older than the Bible, that she had once helped a girl terminate a pregnancy quietly, that she had read from a book with no cover, that her garden bloomed too fast in winter. And in the cold month of November 1487 they came for her. She did not run. She stood in her doorway, wrapped in a shawl, eyes clear. "If this is justice," she said, "then let it be done in daylight." They gave her none, no trial, only a declaration. Heresy, they called it, blasphemy, adultery too, though she had no husband. The list of crimes grew by the hour, as though the sins of every woman before her had been sewn into her name. They dragged her to the cathedral square 3 days later. The Iron Maiden stood there, wheeled into place like a sacred relic. Tall, metallic, shaped like a cloaked figure, face cast in an eternal frown. Its doors were open. The spikes inside glinted in the light of torches. The square was crowded with men, women, and children, all quiet. The bishop said she had betrayed the church. The priest said she had consorted with devils. The guard said nothing. He simply gestured. Magdalena turned to the crowd and spoke once. "I have delivered your sons, buried your daughters, prayed with your dying. If this is my reward, then let it be complete." She stepped forward on her own. The executioner flinched as she approached. She was not screaming, not weeping. Her calm was unbearable. The guards grabbed her arms, if only to fulfill the ritual. Her wrists were bound, her shift stripped from her back. She was placed inside. The door moved slowly, resisting at first, metal scraping stone like thunder. As it closed, the first spike pierced her shoulder, angled downward to avoid the heart. The second drove into her thigh. The third entered her left side, stopping short of the lung. There were 20 in all, none long enough to kill immediately. The door sealed, and the square fell silent. For the first hour, nothing was heard. Then came a sound, not a scream, but something worse. A moan, soft, hoarse, broken. It leaked through the hinges, barely rising above the wind. Some turned away. Others pretended not to hear. But she was still alive. Inside the Iron Maiden, the spikes did not bleed her out quickly. They held her upright, punctured just enough to cause pain, not enough to end it. Her body sagged, impaled at a dozen points, each breath a negotiation with metal. Her blood pooled beneath the doors, slow and steady. Her hands twitched, her jaw clenched. She lasted 4 hours, maybe 5. No one opened the device to check. They waited until morning. When the doors were finally unlatched, steam lifted from the body like incense. She had died upright, eyes open. One hand still clenched into a fist, the other twitching in final defiance. Her blood had run down the interior like paint. The executioner said nothing. He only stepped back, his boots sticking to the ground. There was no burial. Her body was taken beyond the town walls and burned. No marker, no name, no prayer. Only the ashes of the woman who had once delivered half the town. And the Iron Maiden. It was cleaned. Oiled, the rust scraped from its teeth, and wheeled back into the crypt beneath the cathedral where it would rest beside icons and relics, waiting for another soul who dared to speak, to heal, to question. Because the Iron Maiden wasn't just a device. It was doctrine. It didn't crush bones. It erased identity. Its shape, feminine, divine, maternal, was the final insult, the last mockery. A mother of metal who swallowed her daughters whole. Inside, there was no judgment. Only execution disguised as piety. It was designed to mimic forgiveness, arms open wide, a face of peace, but within its hollow shell lay a machinery of pain crafted with surgical intent. And Magdalena, like countless others, became not a martyr, but a warning. The townspeople moved on. Children were born without her hands to guide them. Women whispered to one another in secret. The Iron Maiden was spoken of only when needed, its presence enough to still tongues, to halt questions. No monument was built in her name, but the memory lingered, because even centuries later, in the flicker of torchlight, her screams still echoed from inside that steel chamber, not loud, not sharp, but slow and final. And yet, beyond the Iron Maiden, more brutal truths await, because history never ran out of ways to punish women for simply existing.